Hey guys, before we get started, if you enjoy my content then show your support by liking and subscribing. We are almost at our goal of 500 subscribers, and it would be amazing if you tag along. Thank you for watching and enjoy tonight's stories.
I never really believed in weird haunted stuff. I always figured stories of possessed objects or creepy dolls were just old-school ghost tales that people made up for fun. But I'm telling you, ever since I got that doll off Craigslist for my daughter, nothing has felt normal in my house. It started out so innocent. I've been searching for this particular vintage doll my daughter kept talking about. She'd seen a picture of it online and was obsessed. It was sold out everywhere else, so when I saw an ad on Craigslist offering it at a great price, I jumped on it without hesitation. When I went to pick it up, the seller was this older lady who didn't say much, just smiled in a kind of distant way. She handed me the doll in a plain old box, no wrapping or anything. It looked exactly like the one I'd been trying to find. Same cute little dress, same curly hair, same rosy cheeks. My daughter was over the moon when I brought it home. She aimed the doll and insisted on carrying it around everywhere. It was just another toy as far as I was concerned, something she'd play with for a week, and then toss aside like kids always do. But right from the first night, my daughter had trouble sleeping. She'd come into my room at around 3 in the morning, sobbing, saying she had a bad dream. That wasn't completely unusual. Kids have nightmares. But it started happening every single night, and it was always around the same time, 3 a.m. She'd crawl into my bed, cling to me, and ask if she could keep the lights on. A few nights in, I asked her what was bothering her so much. She got quiet, looked down at her feet, and said, "I'm scared of the man who walks around at night." My heart dropped, because there are only 2 of us in the house, my daughter and me. I tried to brush it off at first, told her it was probably a dream or maybe she heard the wind or the neighbors. But then she started describing him in little details. How tall he was, the sound of his footsteps, how she heard whispering on the stairs. She said she saw him standing near her bedroom door, looking at her doll. I honestly thought she was having an overactive imagination. But then I started waking up at odd times too. I jolt awake with this strange sensation like someone was standing right there in the dark corner of my room. Usually I'd write it off as me just being paranoid because of my daughter's stories, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I'd get up, go check my daughter's room, make sure all the windows and doors were locked. Everything was always secure. But on more than one occasion, I swear I heard soft footsteps upstairs when we were both downstairs. You know how sometimes you feel a vibration through the floor when someone walks around? Yeah, I felt that. And there were nights when I'd walk by the hallway and see the doll just sitting there in the dim light, and it gave me the worst chills. It started to feel like no matter where I went in the house, that doll was always in my peripheral vision. Around the second week, things started getting more unsettling. My daughter came running to me one afternoon, freaking out because she said the doll's head turned on its own. I tried to calm her down, told her that maybe she knocked the doll's head while playing or something. But she insisted she wasn't near it. She'd been coloring in the living room, and the doll was in her bedroom. I walked into her room, and sure enough, the doll was facing the opposite direction from where it usually sat on the shelf. I didn't know how it could have moved, so I just kind of told myself I must have moved it and forgotten. Still, there was this persistent pit in my stomach that made it hard to just dismiss it. Then there was this random cold spot near my daughter's closet. No matter how high I cranked the thermostat, that little area was always freezing. My daughter started refusing to go into her room alone, even during the day, which was totally new. She used to love playing in her room with all her stuffed animals and books. Now, she'd cling to my side or stay in the living room. She wouldn't even look at the doll. Whenever I tried to bring up the idea of getting rid of it, she'd tear up and say she was scared to make it angry. That's when I started realizing maybe it wasn't just an overactive imagination. She was legit terrified, and I'd never seen her like that before. One night I woke up again, that same jolting feeling. It was 3:07 a.m. My digital clock was glowing in the dark. I laid there for a minute, trying to see if I heard anything. The house was dead silent, but then I heard a faint thump from the hallway, like someone had dropped something on the floor. My heart started hammering in my chest. I got up as quietly as I could, grabbed my phone, and used its flashlight to see. When I opened my bedroom door, I didn't see anyone. but the doll was lying face down in the middle of the hallway. It had been in my daughter's room when she went to sleep. There was no reason for it to be in the hallway, let alone face down on the floor. My daughter was sound asleep, so there's no way she moved it. That was my final straw. The next morning, I told her we had to get rid of the doll. I'd never seen her so panicked. She cried and said that if we throw it away, the man might get mad. I tried to reassure her that there was no man, that we were safe, but I was also trembling inside because I wasn't fully convinced I was telling her the truth. The look in her eyes, this sheer, genuine terror, just gutted me. I decided that afternoon I would take the doll far away and dump it, just get it out of our house. When I picked it up, I got this overwhelming sense of dread, like the air around it was heavier than the rest of the room. I put it in a big plastic bag so my daughter wouldn't see it anymore. We drove out to a local landfill area, and I tossed it in a dumpster, hoping that would be the end of it. I practically flew back to the car, locked the doors, and we sped off. That night, my daughter slept through the evening without waking up at 3 a.m., and so did I. No footsteps, no cold spots, nothing. The house finally felt normal again, like this blanket of gloom had been lifted. My daughter still had nightmares for a little while, but they got less frequent. She never mentioned the tall man again. It's been months, and we haven't had any weird incidents since. I don't know what was going on with that doll, or if it was just a bunch of coincidences that stacked up to freak us both out. Either way, I regret ever looking at that Craigslist ad. From now on, if my daughter wants a toy, I'll buy it new, or she just won't get it at all. Some deals aren't worth the anxiety, the sleepless nights, or that nagging fear that something is roaming your halls. We're back to normal, but I have to say, every once in a while, when I walk by my daughter's old toy shelf, I catch myself expecting to see that doll again. It's just this lingering tension, like a scar you can't see but can still feel. And I guess that's what disturbs me the most, knowing how close we came to letting something unexplainable into our home, just because of a silly Craigslist post. I never thought I'd uncover something so unsettling from a simple Craigslist purchase, but that's exactly what happened when I bought a used car last fall. I was just hoping to avoid the overpriced used car lots in my area, and Craigslist had always been my go-to spot for decent deals. I'd gotten furniture, electronics, even a couple of old records that way. So I figured, why not a car? The listing seemed pretty straightforward. The photos were decent, the price was right, and the seller said it had a clean title. All the basics checked out, so I set up a time to see the vehicle. I didn't sense anything off at the time, but in hindsight, maybe I should have been a little more cautious. The car itself was an older sedan, nothing flashy. It had a few dents and scratches, but the interior was relatively clean. It started up without any weird noises, and the mileage was acceptable for its age. The seller acted normal enough. Just some random guy, didn't look suspicious, didn't give off any creepy vibes. He showed me what appeared to be a legit title, said he was moving out of state for a new job, and that he needed to sell quickly. I did a quick test drive around the block. Everything felt fine, so I handed over the cash, got the paperwork, and figured I'd scored a decent bargain. On my way home, I noticed the glove box was jammed shut, but I didn't think much of it. Lots of older cars have little quirks. Sometimes they have stuck compartments or squeaky doors. I figured I'd fix it later, maybe get a new latch. The next day, I swung by an auto parts store to pick up some cleaning supplies. My plan was to really give the car a once-over. I was excited, thinking maybe with a good wash and a little detailing, it'd look pretty good. But that glove box kept bugging me. I wanted to see what was inside. Maybe an owner's manual or leftover junk from the previous owner. That afternoon, I wrestled with the glove box for a good 15 minutes. Finally, I pried it open with a flathead screwdriver. It popped open so suddenly that a couple of random items fell onto the passenger seat. There was an old receipt for gas, a crumpled map, and a large hunting knife wrapped in a rag. At first, I was just confused. Who leaves a big knife in their car like that? But then I noticed there was something smeared on the blade. It looked dark and dried, and it took me a second to realize it was probably blood. That moment froze me in place. I remember just staring at it, my heart thudding in my chest, because it was so unexpected and honestly unnerving. Part of me tried to rationalize it, like maybe it was animal blood if the previous owner was a hunter. But it didn't look like old hunting equipment. The handle was scuffed up, and the blade had this weird blackish red residue near the edge. The rag it was in also had these nasty dark stains. The more I looked, the more I could feel this tightness in my stomach. You never think you'll stumble upon something that could hint at serious violence. But there I was, gripping a blood-stained knife in my newly purchased car. I started asking myself a bunch of questions. Was it related to some crime scene? Did the former owner do something horrible, or was it just a bizarre coincidence? My instincts told me to call the police, but I also felt this weird hesitation. What if this was nothing? What if it was indeed just from hunting, and I was overreacting? But then again, it was definitely a suspicious thing to leave behind. I couldn't help wondering if the guy who sold me the car knew about it. The glove box was jammed, so maybe he never bothered opening it and had no clue. Or maybe he jammed it on purpose to hide whatever was in there. I ended up taking a bunch of photos of the knife, including the stains and the rag, just in case I needed to explain myself later. Then I carefully wrapped it back up. My mind kept racing, flipping between calling the cops or just tossing it. But what if it was connected to something bigger, and me throwing it away messed up some investigation? That evening, I stayed home and tried to research if there were any missing person cases or unsolved crimes in the area. I found a couple of vague news stories, but nothing that jumped out as obviously linked to this knife. The next day, I drove to the police station. The last thing I wanted was to have a potential murder weapon on my hands. I didn't want to get tangled up in something ugly, especially with me being the new owner of the car. When I handed it over to the officer on duty, I could see them exchange looks. It was definitely out of the ordinary for some random person to stroll in with a bloody knife. They took it seriously, bagged it as evidence, and asked me a series of questions about how I found it and who sold me the car. I gave them all the details I had, the Craigslist listing, the phone number, the general description of the guy. I couldn't really offer much else, because I'd only met him that one time. They said they'd look into it, maybe test the blood if they suspected it was human. But they didn't give me any definitive answers right then. I went home feeling uneasy, like I was caught in a weird limbo. Over the next few weeks, I'd randomly think about it and get nervous every time I saw a police car drive by my street, wondering if they'd show up to ask more questions or if they'd discovered something terrible. In the meantime, I tried to just treat the car like a normal used vehicle. I cleaned it up, changed the oil, vacuumed out the trunk, but every time I sat in the driver's seat, I had this creeping thought. What if something bad happened here? Months went by, and I never heard back from the police. I'm guessing they either didn't find anything traceable, or it was some weird situation that didn't lead anywhere. But it still left me on edge. I think about it whenever I see a violent news story. I wonder if the person who sold me the car was involved, or if the knife belonged to a previous owner before him. Maybe nobody will ever know. It's a bizarre feeling, owning something that might have a dark history you can't fully uncover. I ended up selling that car after about a year. It worked fine, but I couldn't shake the weirdness. Every time I grabbed the steering wheel, I'd think about that afternoon when I first pried open the glove box. I get this little jolt of memory, picturing that dark residue on the blade, the rag's crusty stains, and the surge of dread that washed over me. I disclosed everything to the new buyer, though not in detail, just said I found something suspicious in the glove box and had turned it over to the police. That was enough for them to raise an eyebrow, but they still wanted the car. I guess some people don't get creeped out as easily. To this day, I still scroll through Craigslist from time to time, but I'm way more cautious. If I see something listed at a price that seems too good to be true, I think back to that knife. The experience was a jarring reminder that you really have no idea what a used car, or any used item, has been through. On the outside, it might just look like a regular sit-in with a few scrapes. But it could be harboring secrets in its compartments, evidence of something you'd never want to be mixed up in. I try not to dwell on it, but it definitely made me more hesitant about buying big-ticket items from strangers. I haven't had any direct run-ins with the police since then, and nobody ever followed up with me about the knife. Maybe it was never even used in a crime, and I freaked out for no reason. Or maybe it was tied to something that will forever remain unsolved. Either way, it's something I'd rather not relive. The memory of opening that glove box and seeing that blood-stained blade just sticks in my head like a scene from a horror movie I can't unsee. In the end, I moved on, got a different car, and just tried to put the whole thing behind me. It's not exactly a story I bring up at parties, because people either think I'm exaggerating or get really uncomfortable. But it happened, and it's made me look at every Craigslist deal through a more skeptical lens. I guess you can never be too careful when you're buying from an unknown source. The question is, how many other cars are out there with secrets tucked away in their glove boxes, waiting to be discovered by the next unsuspecting owner? I try not to think too hard about that. I'd rather keep my eyes forward and focus on the road ahead. I never expected a single baseball card to turn into one of the most stressful experiences of my life. I've collected cards casually since I was a kid. Nothing super expensive, just a hobby I always enjoyed. I'll flip through Craigslist listings from time to time, hoping to snag a good deal on cards people no longer care about or even ones they don't know the real value of. That's how I stumbled on the listing that started it all. It was just a simple post, box of old baseball cards, $20. No photos, no details, just a short description. Most of the time, these posts end up being a bust, stacks of junk cards from the 80s and 90s that aren't really worth anything. But I was bored on a Friday afternoon and figured, why not? Maybe I'll find something interesting. I messaged the seller, and we arranged to meet up in a parking lot near my house. The seller handed me a cardboard box. I did a quick peek inside and saw a bunch of random cards. Most were in mediocre shape, edges frayed and corners bent. There was one small plastic sleeve in there with a card that looked older, and that immediately grabbed my attention. I didn't want to tip the seller off, so I tried to act casual. I handed over the $20, thanked them, and brought the box back to my car. Only once I got home did I realize how potentially valuable that one card might be. It was an older rookie card of a famous player, a bit worn, but still possibly worth hundreds. Maybe even 1,000 if I got lucky. I'd never owned anything close to that valuable in my collection before, so I was pretty excited. Over the weekend, I did some research online, checked recent sales on auction sites, and got more and more convinced I'd hit the jackpot. I guess while I was busy celebrating, the seller must have done some research too, because early the next week I got a message from them. They basically said they wanted the card back and that they'd pay me $20 for it, or refund me, as they put it. At first, I didn't think much of it. As far as I knew, once the deal's done, it's done. They can't force me to give it back. So I politely declined and explained that I was keeping it. That's where the messages started getting more insistent. They said I'd ripped them off. They claimed they didn't realize how expensive the card was and that it wasn't fair I got it at such a low price. I still didn't budge. I reminded them they'd posted the listing, they named the price, and I paid it. That's how deals work. A few days went by with no new messages, so I assumed they gave up. But then I started noticing weird friend requests and direct messages on my social media accounts from usernames I didn't recognize. Each time I'd block or ignore them, another one would pop up. Some were threatening, telling me I'd regret stealing the card, saying they had my address, which they actually did because we'd met near my house. I didn't think that through at the time. It was unnerving, but I also figured they were just bluffing, trying to scare me. I changed some of my privacy settings and hoped that would be the end of it. But it escalated. I'd be out shopping or grabbing a coffee, and I'd get the eerie feeling someone was watching me. A couple times, I noticed the same person from a distance, lurking but never approaching. I started becoming paranoid. I look over my shoulder a lot, check my surroundings, and get jumpy if someone walked too close. I told a few friends about it, and they said I should just ignore it or maybe threaten legal action. I thought about calling the police, but I wasn't sure what to tell them. I bought a baseball card, and the seller wants it back, and now I feel paranoid. I wasn't convinced they'd take me seriously. One afternoon, I actually caught a glimpse of someone snapping pictures of me outside my apartment building. By the time I turned around to confront them, they were gone. That really freaked me out. I realized these messages and random sightings weren't random coincidences. They were actively stalking me. I tried to remember everything about the original seller, what kind of car they drove, what they looked like. Nothing stood out as odd back then. I only remembered them being average height, average build, typical outfit. It made it harder to describe them to anyone. I started documenting everything just in case. Screenshots of threatening messages, times and dates I saw suspicious people watching me. I was hoping this would just die down on its own, but it didn't. It got worse. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to hear noises in my front yard. I looked out the window and saw two people standing in the dark. They were wearing masks, trying to jimmy open my side window. My heart went into overdrive. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. But by the time I got someone on the line, the two people had already run off. My adrenaline was so high that I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I found the window partially pried open and footprints in the dirt. That's when I knew I had to get the police involved seriously. This was no longer just weird messages and intimidation. Someone had actually tried to break in. I went to the police station, filed a detailed report, and gave them everything I had: the original Craigslist post, the messages, the screenshots of all those weird accounts, and my account of the attempted break-in. The officer I spoke with took it seriously, especially the break-in part, and said they'd sent patrols around my neighborhood, and I should call immediately if I saw or heard anything suspicious. For the next week, I saw a police car parked down the street late at night. That gave me some relief, but I was still nervous every time I walked outside or came home from work. It's a terrible feeling to think someone's out there, angry enough to try and scare you in your own home. During that week, I didn't see any more masked people, but I did spot a couple of suspicious cars driving by slowly. One night, while the police cruiser was there, a car rolled past my place a few times, then sped off. I guess whoever was behind this decided it wasn't worth getting caught. I kept thinking, all this over a baseball card. It blew my mind that someone would go this far. I guess they believed they'd been cheated, but in reality, they were the one who listed it without checking the value. I couldn't wrap my head around the obsession or the lengths they were willing to go. When the week ended, the police presence died down. I was on my own again, which was nerve-wracking. I installed some cheap security cameras around my house. Just little motion sensor cameras that would record if someone walked by. I also told my neighbors to keep an eye out. For a while, I was hypervigilant, making sure my doors and windows were locked at all times, checking my cameras if I heard any strange noises. It felt like I was living in a mini-war zone over something that started off so trivial. Over time, the threats slowed down. I still got an occasional weird email or random follow request on social media, but it wasn't as intense. I don't know if the seller moved on to harassing someone else or finally realized the police had a record of everything. I just knew I was tired of living with so much paranoia. Part of me even considered selling the card just so I could be done with this entire nightmare, but that felt like giving in. The card itself still felt like a symbol of how messed up things had gotten, though. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded of late-night footsteps outside my window and those masked figures. After a couple of months, life mostly returned to normal. I think the biggest change was me becoming a lot more cautious about how I do business online. I no longer meet people anywhere near my house if I'm buying or selling something. I try to use more public, well-lit places. I also check people's identities a little more thoroughly, and if something feels even slightly off, I don't go through with the deal. That might be a bit over the top, but after going through all that stress and fear, I'd rather be safe than sorry. I still have the card. It sits in a protective case now, stored away with the rest of my collection. Sometimes I'll come across it when I'm reorganizing things, and I'll get that uneasy feeling all over again. It's such a strange object to spark this chain of harassment. Just a small piece of cardboard with a player's picture on it. I guess some people can't handle losing out on a deal. All I know is that I learned the hard way. There's a dark side to finding too good to be true bargains on Craigslist, and it can turn your life upside down in a matter of days. All told, I was lucky the break-in attempt didn't go any further. A week of police surveillance helped a lot, and no serious harm was done. But that lingering sense of someone watching or waiting took a long time to fade. Even now, I'll catch myself second-guessing if I see a stranger at the grocery store who looks vaguely like the person I remember from that first transaction. Maybe it's just paranoia, or maybe I'll never fully trust these kinds of deals again. Either way, I'm grateful it's over, and I hope no one else has to go through the same kind of intimidation over something as silly as a baseball card. But it happened, and it's something I'll probably never forget. One of those weird nightmares you can't quite believe actually happened until you're right there living it. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation where I'd be staring down the barrel of a gun over something as ordinary as buying a second-hand phone off Craigslist. But here I am, months later, still replaying every minute of that day in my head. It's crazy how one decision, something as simple as wanting a cheap upgrade, can spiral into the worst day of your life. I guess I got caught up in the excitement of finding a good deal and never really stopped to think about what could go wrong. My old phone was on its last legs, and I wanted an upgrade without breaking the bank. Everybody I knew kept telling me I should just go to the store, finance a brand new one, and call it a day. But I was stubborn. I'd always had good luck buying stuff online, so I figured Craigslist was no different. People sell used phones all the time. I'd find a decent one at half the cost, meet the seller somewhere public, and be done in a few minutes. It sounded so simple. I scrolled through endless ads, reading descriptions, looking for something in good condition that fit my budget. Finally, I found this listing for a phone that was exactly what I wanted. New model, good price, and the pictures looked legit. The ad wasn't anything flashy, just said the phone was lightly used and that the seller needed to unload it fast. I reached out through email first, mostly because I wanted a paper trail in case something was off. The guy wrote back pretty quick, giving me a short backstory about how he got a work phone and no longer needed his personal one. The details all seemed reasonable. He didn't want to handle shipping, so he preferred to meet locally. He mentioned a nearby parking lot that he said was convenient for both of us. The idea of meeting in a parking lot was a little iffy, but I'd done that kind of thing before for other Craigslist deals, and it always worked out fine. I told him it sounded good, gave him a time I could come by, and we set a date. When the day came, I remember feeling a small jolt of excitement because I was finally going to get rid of my cracked, slow, nearly useless phone. I hopped in my car after work and drove about 20 minutes to this strip mall. I was expecting the usual routine. Meet someone in a well-lit area, check out the phone, hand over the cash, and walk away satisfied. But from the second I arrived, something felt off. The parking lot wasn't super busy. There were only a few cars around, and most of the shops on that side had already closed for the day. It was getting close to dusk, so the sun was still out, but it was starting to dip behind the buildings. I circled around, trying to spot the seller's car. He never actually described what he'd be driving, which should have been a red flag for me. But I guess I was too focused on scoring that sweet deal. I parked toward the back, where there were fewer cars, hoping to avoid the heavier traffic near the entrance. I texted the number he'd given me, letting him know I was there. He replied almost immediately, telling me to wait by my car and that he'd be there in a minute. So I sat there, scrolling mindlessly through social media on my almost dead phone, waiting for a stranger I'd never met, about to make a transaction that in hindsight seems insanely risky. After a few minutes, a sit-in pulled up a couple of parking spaces away from me, not directly next to me but close enough. I figured this had to be the seller. The driver just sat there with the engine running, so I got out to approach the passenger side, thinking maybe he just didn't want to get out of the car. That's when everything started to unravel. Almost as soon as I stood up, another car came screeching around the corner of the lot. It pulled in right behind me, blocking my car in. Before I could react, two guys jumped out. They had masks on, plain ski masks, and I felt a wave of panic start to crawl through my body. One of them had a handgun drawn, pointed directly at my chest. The other one was holding what looked like a small bat or pipe. I didn't even know what to think. I just froze. My first instinct was to run, but I could barely move. I felt like my legs turned to jelly, and my brain was scrambling to catch up with what was happening. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. It was one of those moments where time slows down, but at the same time, everything's moving so fast you can't even process it. The guy with the gun screamed something, but I couldn't make out his words. I just saw the gun, his mask, and the menacing energy in his posture. The other guy dashed forward and yanked my car door open. He leaned in, rummaging for whatever he could find, grabbing my backpack from the passenger seat. All I could think about was that I had my wallet, laptop, and a few other valuables in there. But more than anything, I was just terrified they'd decide to pull the trigger, and I'd be left bleeding out in an empty parking lot. Before I knew it, the sedan that had pulled up earlier started moving. Instead of helping me, it drove off. That's when I realized that was probably part of the setup. The driver must have been working with them, luring me in under the pretense of selling a phone. And now I was trapped between my car and these masked men, with nowhere to go. The guy with the handgun gestured wildly, and I understood he wanted my wallet, phone, whatever I had on me. I reached in my pocket, hands trembling like crazy, and held out my wallet. He snatched it and shoved it into the bag his partner was carrying. Then he motioned at my phone, and I dropped it on the ground without thinking. He grabbed it, chucked it toward the car they arrived in, and turned back to face me. I remember standing there, not breathing, hoping this was the part where they'd leave. My stomach was in knots. Every second felt like it could be the one where he decided to pull the trigger. The weird thing was, they never said a word. They just gestured and made noises, like they didn't want me to remember their voices or anything that could give them away. After what felt like an eternity, they hopped back in their car, slammed the doors, and reversed out of the parking space with a screech of tires. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching their taillights disappear. My entire body felt like it was on fire, my mind racing to figure out what just happened. Eventually, I snapped out of my daze and looked around, half expecting someone to pop up and ask if I was okay. But there was nobody there. Not a single person had witnessed the robbery. I was alone, still trembling, trying to piece together some plan of action. My backpack was gone, my wallet was gone, my phone was gone. Even my car keys were in the backpack, so I couldn't go anywhere. I was stranded. It took me a moment to realize I still had a spare key hidden in a magnetic case under my car. That was the one saving grace in that moment. I fumbled around underneath, found the spare, and jumped into my car. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the key in the ignition. I started the car and just sat there, breathing heavily, trying to slow my heart rate down. I ended up driving to the nearest police station, which took about 10 minutes. The whole way there, I kept checking my mirrors, paranoid that they might be following me or that I'd run into them again. By the time I parked at the station, I felt so drained, like I'd run a marathon. Going inside and explaining everything to the officer on duty was surreal. I recounted the events, gave them as many details as I could. What the men were wearing, what kind of car they had, how the setup was arranged. They took notes, asked a bunch of questions, and told me they'd do their best to investigate. But to be honest, I could tell they'd seen this scenario play out before. It's one of those crimes that happen quickly, with few leads. They told me to cancel my credit cards, change passwords on any accounts, and try to lock my phone remotely if possible. I felt stupid for being so careless, but at the same time, it all happened so fast. Over the next few days, I had to deal with the fallout. I replaced my cards, changed all my passwords, and got a new ID. My sense of security, though, was shattered. I started getting nervous whenever someone pulled up next to me in a parking lot. If a stranger walked too close, my heart would jump. I shared what happened with friends and family, and everyone had the same shock reaction. I can't believe that happened over a phone. But that's the thing. These criminals don't care what you came to buy or sell. They just see an easy target. And I guess that day, I was an easy target. I'm not sure if the police ever made any headway on the case. They never contacted me to say they'd caught the guys or found my stuff. I figured that was the end of it, and eventually I had to move on. I'm still mad at myself for not being more cautious. Since then, I've avoided Craigslist for anything that requires meeting in person. It's just not worth the risk. I'd rather pay a bit more at a legitimate store than risk going through something like that again. All said and done, it's been a rough lesson in how quickly things can go south when you let your guard down. I walked into that parking lot thinking I was making a smart financial move, and I left without my wallet, my phone, or any feeling of safety. I'm grateful I walked away unharmed, but it was pure luck that I didn't end up in the hospital or worse. Now, whenever someone mentions Craigslist deals, I can't help but tense up. It's a gut reaction I can't shake, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe I need that constant reminder to stay alert, because sometimes all it takes is a split second for life to flip upside down. That day still sits with me, and I doubt I'll ever fully get over it. All I know is, if I had the chance to go back, I'd definitely do things differently. But that's not how life works. You live through it, and you try to move on. And even though I've got a new phone and all my accounts are secure again, the memory of that evening in that empty parking lot still lingers, flashing through my mind every now and then. It's a harsh reminder of how a simple deal can turn into a nightmare when you least expect it. I honestly never thought I'd end up working security in an unfinished mall of all places. I found the job listing on Craigslist, which already felt kinda sketchy, but I was desperate for extra cash. The ad said they needed an overnight guard to watch over a new mall being built on the outskirts of town. The pay was surprisingly good for what sounded like easy work. Basically just patrol the empty halls, keep an eye on security cameras, and make sure no one sneaks in to vandalize the place. I figured I'd be bored most of the time, but I needed the money, so I signed up without a second thought. The day I showed up for orientation, the project manager gave me a quick rundown. The place wasn't fully operational, but there was enough electricity to keep the lights on in the hallways, run a few cameras, and power a small security office. He said they had issues with people breaking in and stealing construction materials at night, so they wanted a guard there until the mall was officially open. It all sounded normal. But then I heard a rumor, just a little side comment from one of the construction workers, that the property used to be an abandoned mental hospital. Apparently they tore down most of the old structure, but some of the foundation remained. I'm not superstitious, but something about that gave me a weird chill. Still, I brushed it off because a job's a job. My first shift started at 10 p.m. The mall was eerily silent, with half-finished storefronts, exposed wiring, and plastic sheets covering uninstalled fixtures. I sat in the security room, a tiny space with a desk, a few monitors, and an old chair that squeaked every time I moved. There was a set of keys, a flashlight, and a map of the mall that I was supposed to use for my patrol rounds. At first, I was just messing around on my phone, occasionally glancing at the screens. The cameras were black and white, and most showed empty corridors that felt weirdly claustrophobic even on a little monitor. After a couple of hours, boredom started to set in, so I decided to do a quick walk around the main corridors. I grabbed the flashlight, locked the security office, and set off. The place was massive, 2 floors, a bunch of escalators that weren't working yet, and a food court area that smelled faintly of fresh paint and sawdust. Every step I took a code. It was pretty unsettling, to be honest, like walking around an abandoned building in some horror movie. But I kept reminding myself that it was just a construction site with no one around. That's when I started hearing noises. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe the ventilation system kicking on. But it sounded more like footsteps in the distance. I would walk down one hall, and I'd swear I heard shuffling somewhere behind me. I'd spin around and shine my flashlight, but there was nothing. Not a single person, no sign of movement. It rattled me a bit, but I tried to stay calm. Figured maybe I was just jittery because it was my first night, and the place was so empty. After making a loop through the first floor, I headed back to the security room. I decided to scan the cameras more thoroughly, just to make sure no one was sneaking around. I flipped through the feeds, and for a second, I could have sworn I saw a dark figure move past one of the cameras near an unfinished storefront. My heart skipped a beat. I rewound the footage a little, but there was nothing there on replay, just an empty corridor. I told myself I was probably imagining it. Stress can make you see stuff that's not there, right? But it happened again. Another camera, different angle, a quick flicker of something dark moving across the screen. This time, it seemed to pause near the escalator, like it was just standing there. When I leaned in for a closer look, the figure vanished. My stomach was in knots because I was alone in this half-built mall, and now I had no idea if someone, or something, was actually out there. The curiosity got the better of me, so I grabbed my flashlight and did another patrol, this time focusing on the areas where I saw the movement. No luck, just empty halls, a few scattered boxes, and that unsettling silence that felt heavier now. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, so I started looking up info about the old mental hospital on my phone. There wasn't a ton of detail, just a few local legends about how the hospital shut down decades ago due to poor funding and rumored malpractice. Some people said the building was haunted. Others said it was just a rundown place where squatters used to hang out. Either way, the fact that I was sitting in a newly constructed mall, built right on top of it, gave me a bad vibe. I tried to distract myself, but every so often, I'd hear faint taps or creaks that made me jump. Around 2 a.m., I saw it on the cameras again, this time longer. The feed on camera 3 flickered, and a tall, shadowy figure slid into view, paused, then disappeared behind a corner. It definitely wasn't just a trick of the light. My heart started pounding. I thought maybe there was an actual intruder who'd broken in. So I radioed the construction foreman's number, which they'd given me for emergencies, to see if any workers were scheduled to be inside. No answer? Great. I debated calling the cops, but I wasn't even 100% sure what I was seeing. Last thing I wanted was to make a fool of myself or get fired on my first week. I decided to go check it out for real. Adrenaline was pumping. I left the security office again, flashlight in hand, and followed the route I believed the figure was taking. The air felt thick, like it was harder to breathe. Every corridor I turned down, I expected to see someone darting away, but there was never anyone there. Just the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, half of them flickering because they weren't fully installed yet. I found myself near the old service elevator, which wasn't operational. It was locked up with metal gates. The area was pitch dark, so I shone my flashlight around. Nothing. But the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up like I wasn't alone. Then I heard footsteps. Clear, deliberate steps coming from the direction of the food court. I turned my flashlight that way and went quietly, my heart thumping so loud I thought it'd give me away. The footsteps stopped as soon as I reached the edge of the food court. All I saw was a row of empty stalls, some construction equipment lying around, and an escalator that was blocked off by caution tape. I walked up to the escalator and peered down. My flashlight beam landed on something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the dust, heading up the escalator. But they just stopped halfway. Nothing led off to the side, it just vanished like whoever was walking had dissolved into thin air. At that point, I was genuinely freaked out. I decided to head back to the security room and stay put for the rest of my shift, keeping my eyes glued to the cameras. But as soon as I started walking away, I felt a distinct presence behind me. You know that feeling you get when someone's standing too close, even if you can't see them? That's exactly what I felt. I spun around with the flashlight, but the beam landed on empty air. The moment I turned away again, I swore I heard a whisper. Couldn't make out words, but it was like a hushed, rasping sound right next to my ear. I bolted for the security office, not even trying to act tough anymore. Back in the office, I locked the door. I was shaking so bad I could barely keep my eyes on the monitors. I glanced over every feed, expecting that figure to pop up any second. My entire shift I was on edge. Finally, the clock hit 6 a.m., and the first few construction workers arrived. I practically ran out, jumped in my car, and drove home. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself I was imagining things, that the footsteps and the shadow figure were just me psyching myself out because the place was spooky, and I'd heard those rumors about the old hospital. But the next night, the same stuff happened. The cameras would glitch and show dark shapes. I'd hear footsteps echoing in distant corridors. Sometimes I'd see a door at the far end of a hallway slowly move, like someone was gently pushing it open. Then I'd go to investigate, and there'd be no one around. Each shift felt like a slow crawl through some twisted version of those horror games, where you watch the cameras and wait for something to jump out at you. Except this was real life, and I was the only one in the building. I tried telling a coworker about it, someone else who worked the daytime shift, but he just shrugged and said he never saw anything weird. That made me feel crazy, but I knew what I experienced. It was all too vivid to be in my head. By the end of the week, I decided enough was enough. The money wasn't worth the constant anxiety. Every night I was exhausted, heart pounding, seeing and hearing things that made zero sense. I called the manager and told him I was done. He didn't seem surprised, just thanked me for my time and said they'd find someone else. I packed up my stuff, left the security badge on the desk, and didn't look back as I walked out. I've worked some odd jobs, but that one left a mark on me I can't forget. Even now, if I see a half-finished building at night, I get chills. I think about that massive mall, built over the ruins of a mental hospital, and how the shadows seem to come alive in the darkness. Nothing ever physically harmed me, but those nightly encounters were more than enough. Maybe there was some logical explanation, faulty cameras, echoes in the empty halls. But it felt too real, too targeted, like something was genuinely lurking in there. I still find myself checking camera feeds in my head, as if I'm back in that little security office, waiting for the flicker of a shadow across the screen. Either way, I walked away and never looked back. The mall eventually opened to the public, and people shop there now without a clue of what it was like before. I can't help but wonder if they ever feel uneasy in certain corners or catch a glimpse of something moving where it shouldn't be. Maybe it's all in my mind, or maybe that place still holds echoes of what once went on in that old hospital. I'm just glad I'm not the one who has to find out.
Thank you for watching tonight's stories. If you enjoyed any of the stories, share your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to read them. Thank you, and until next time.